Thank you so much, Professor Biju, once again for inviting me for this very thought-provoking session on International Biodiversity Day. I have heard some of the very eminent speakers in the field of health as well as conservation, and it's a privilege to share my space with them. I think a lot has been shared already on why we need to conserve native biodiversities, and why our own Ayurvedic measures are more important to be well understood and recognized, first of all, in our country and also globally, because of in-depth of knowledge they bring. My presentation will be more based on my more than a decade of work on nature-based solution, because this is what I bring to the table, and that is what I have been doing for last more than 1.5 decades. Starting from Indian Himalayan region, I started my work in Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, working with the communities. And then after joining NEERI almost 8 years back, I got this privilege to work in different agro-ecosystems of the country. And I'll share my experiences with what I felt working in these ecosystems and working with the people of these areas. I presently work with the Critical Zone Research Group. That's one of the multidisciplinary research group that tries to look into water, energy, food nexus in different parts of the country, with a special focus on Vidarbha, where farmer suicide are more common. And the second important thing is why farmer suicide have become more common, and why ecosystem services started fading out from this region. How people from sustainable water consumption and using in agriculture, that we call as precision agriculture, precision irrigation, has changed into intensive use of groundwater dependency and also intensive chemical use. I know a lot of audience in this webinar are a lot of students from different parts of the country. And just for their sake, a few of the slides that I'm sure could bring some kind of sense of understanding why we need to consider biodiversity conservation as the top priority right now for the entire world, everybody. If you see a lot of logos on my first slide, that shows how much global consensus is there right now for conservation of biodiversity. You talk about sustainable development goals that Professor Biju was talking in the very first initial slides of this webinar, or you talk about HE targets, you talk about disaster risk reduction, you talk about climate change adaptation and mitigation, or you talk about water conservation. We somehow stand on understanding that biodiversity is one of the most important things right now for the present generation and also for the forthcoming generations. And rightly, my few previous speakers have also stressed that why to ensure our well-being, how to ensure our good health, it is important that we consider biodiversity in plants, in animals, and also the ecosystems that bring a lot of diverse biodiversity to us. Now, we all know that the biodiversity this year is being celebrated for, we are part of the solution for nature. We all stand as different jigsaw puzzle pieces that can help to make this entire puzzle complete, bring certain kind of solution, if not in a larger, bigger way, at least at our own individual ways to conserve nature. What we have felt in last 1.5 years almost, that it's important to conserve biodiversity, not because only it gives us provisioning benefits, regulating and supporting benefits, but also we felt that in last 1 year, there are a lot of psychological benefits that were required for a lot of us suffering from COVID or COVID-related miseries. Some kind of attachment, some kind of benefits that we could feel while being with nature, being surrounded by nature for a few hours, few minutes, gave some kind of psychological benefit. So stressing on those psychological benefits, I'd like to start, and then we can diverge on different parts of ecosystem benefits or nature's contribution to people. So in all, we know that we all are interconnected in some way to nature, and we all are part of this entire solution that we can bring. It's not only the commitment and responsibility of the governments, of administrators, of all the academicians that are part of this program, but also every single audience, every single individual that is sitting here, not only indigenous people, but also urban locals who are very much part of this interconnectedness. Now, why this is important at policy level, we know that last year was going to be a very important year. IUCN was going to have World Conservation Congress to have next 4 years of agenda for conservation. CBD was going, Convention on Biodiversity was going to meet and understand what should be the post 2020 global biodiversity targets. We know that HE targets came in 2010, but unfortunately, short-term goals have still not been achieved. A lot of people around the world still don't understand the importance of nature around us, the importance of benefits of nature around us. And now, after a decade that closed by UN was on nature conservation, ecosystem conservation, and biodiversity conservation in 2020, we are now given a new decade on ecosystem restoration. It's high time. If we don't start conserving, restoring nature, maybe it will be too late. And I should say it's already a little late when we are already standing on the second surge of pandemic that was even more disastrous than last year. So this urges for the reality to be understood and acknowledged that we need to understand the benefits of restoration and start doing it at local levels. Now, it's not only the pandemic that has given us this realization. I'm sure we all have been hearing about this UNFCCC reports, and recently also Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report. One of the reports that came in 2019 on global assessment of biodiversity showed millions of our species are under threat, and they all might go extinct in a few coming years. There is also a global assessment indication that a lot of ecosystems, especially marine ecosystems, are under severe pressure by anthropogenic sources. Then IPCC highlighted in 2019 about the global warming 1.5 degree centigrade report that again can only be brought down if we have conserved ecosystems, if we have restored ecosystems, if we have healthy ecosystems. Again, the UNCCD, the UN Convention on Deforestation and Degradation COP that happened in Delhi in 2019, stressed on the importance of restoration to achieve sustainable development goals, to localize sustainable development goals, and that will not be possible unless poorest of poor people in the country, the most marginalized communities living in the corners and nooks and corners of the country are involved in these restoration efforts, given some kind of livelihood benefits to get involved with these, and ensure that we have some kind of change happening in terms of conservation on ground. Now, 2020 became a year of reflection. 2021 is now stressing the growing need to find and implementing solutions for nature conservation. Rightly pointed out one of my previous speakers of the panel that it stresses on build back better. Now, those who understand the slogan of build back better, they know that it's a very disaster-centric slogan. Whenever there is a disaster somewhere in different part of a country or the world, the disaster managers, the disaster people who actually take care of these disaster stress on building back better. This was first time in the history of nature conservation when global communities started talking about build back better, even with reference for nature conservation. And rightly, he also pointed out, it's not only build back better, it's also build back much better in future. Whatever we have lost, we should try to and ensure that it is much better than what we have lost. So while we are trying in terms of, what health professionals in the country are trying to bend the curve of COVID-19. At the same time, there should be efforts at our level to also bend the curve of biodiversity loss. While there was indication by one of the previous speakers also on how biodiversity started rejuvenating in different parts of the country when they were locked down. But at the same time, it is also important to highlight a lot of wildlife trafficking also started happening in different parts of the country, and it was more than 50 times more than what was happening in normal days. But COVID was not the only thing that was happening in last 1.5 years. We have Amphan last year that hit the east coast, especially the Sundarban Delta. Then we have two more important cyclone, and recently Tauktae has devastated many parts of the west coast. Then locust attack. This all shows that somehow we are in a very alarming condition. One way or other, nature is giving us these alarming indications that we need to actually start rethinking our concerns and commitments for nature if we actually want to ensure well-being of not only us, but also our future generations. And I feel more concerned about our future generations, because this is the kind of world we are living in, but we don't know what kind of world they will be living in if the similar kind of situation and pandemic emerge year after year. Now, it's very important to highlight this IPBES report, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem report on COVID-19. It came in December 2020, and we were part of this IPBES assessment. And there were clear indication about three important areas that have resulted in the emergence of pandemic. We earlier also have different pandemics. We have swine flu, we have bird flu. We also had Nipah virus and Ebola as well. But this is very serious. So the three important indications were the ecological disruption, the fragmentation, deforestation, and degradation that's very common across the world right now, and also in our part of the country. Then the second important area was land use change. This change was because of agriculture intensification, monocropping, cash cropping, and of course, urbanization, the expansion of urbanization in different parts of the country. We all are aware that China and India by 2050 will be the most urbanized nations in the world. So these were also one of the major indicators, major reasons for emergence of pandemics, and about 30% of pandemic contribution came for that, because of that. We already have heard about the wet markets of Wuhan and wildlife trade. But still, while I was part of sustainable use of wildlife assessment, I should share that this wildlife trade has gone deeper in our, in our societies. People are going for wildlife trade, those who are poor, but at the same time, a lot of middlemen are bringing profits just because of trading these very vulnerable species and threatened on their own. Now, coming back to the country and bringing some kind of interesting parts, why biodiversity is important. It's not only that biodiversity per se is important, because we all know that it gives us a lot of provisioning benefits, a lot of regulating services, and lots of supporting services. It's important also to understand that our forests are home to more than 80% of terrestrial biodiversity of the country, be it Central India, Western Ghats, or Himalayas, or island biodiversity. These are also home to 300 million indigenous people who directly or indirectly depend on these forests. At the same time, they have huge dependency for their subsistence livelihood. So that makes sure to understand that how much important these forests are, not only for us, but also a larger population that is living very close to these forest areas. At the same time, government wants that whatever international commitments we are promising, we are agreeing to, be it climate commitment or sustainable development goals or convention on biodiversity, this all should be fulfilled one way or other by this biodiversity and forest cover that we have. At the time, there is a huge pressure on Indian government that we should go for 33% of forest cover by 2022. And I think this is a very, very ambitious plan, because our natural forests at many parts of the country are no more natural. They are being modified, they are being transformed because of anthropogenic pressure. And now there is a huge scope that is being seen towards urban green spaces. Government has started looking outside forest, outside trees. They're now trying to see tree outside forest, especially in avenue plantations or agroforestry areas that are again a huge contribution by local communities who have developed these plantations after years of their own choices and practices. So this forest biodiversity conservation also brings a lot of attention when we talk about conservation of biodiversity and climate commitments. This is one of the pictures that I bring from Kedarnath Valley, but I'm sure these pictures are quite similar in different parts of the country, where a single resource here, what I'm showing is a dwarf bamboo that is one of the threatened varieties of Himalayas, and it is used for fodder, it is used for fuel wood, it is used for making storage articles. It is also connected with their forest-dependent agriculture that is still more organic and still very indigenous in crops and cropping practices. So there are subsistent provisioning benefits. At the same time, biodiversity also ensures human well-being. And the picture that I'm sharing here is one of the pictures from Meghalaya, one of the biodiversity hotspots in Clariat. And if you can see, one of the prairie-like grassland is not actually a grassland character of this particular landscape. This is because of the customary rack hole mining that has resulted in denudation of these forests and converted these streams that are flowing in this area into acidic character. We got even a pH of 2.5 to 3 in this particular area with no birds, no biodiversity almost. We didn't find any pollinators in this particular area. So that shows the concern that that biodiversity has in some of the very hot spots, what we call about biodiversity. And we need to actually pay attention to them, especially local communities, on understanding what kind of threat we are going to have for these biodiversity landscape in the future. Now, crop diversification is again a very important provisioning benefit that this nature brings to us. And crop diversification, local knowledge is something that needs to be preserved because this is very indigenous, at the same time, very stress tolerant, famine food, and also climate adaptive crop. That is slowly getting shifted to cash cropping patterns that is more water intensive and requires more chemical input. So in some years, this will be again a pressure to local ecosystems. Now, riverine and wetland water security is also important to understand in different parts of our country, be it Kerala or Himalayas or Northeast or Central India. But at the same time, we have been so irresponsible with our thinking that we are trying to even damage these important ecosystems that can be very good buffers for so many things in our disaster risk reduction approach. So these two important landscapes, if you see in many parts of India, are now concretized. Their watersheds are concretized. Their the banks are concretized, and a lot of infrastructure buildup has reduced subsurface flow in this area. So this is one of the findings that we found for Nainital and adjoining areas based on High Court of Nainital directions. Now moving to, again, mountain vegetation, be it in Shola forest in Western Ghats or different forest types in Western Ghats, or the Trans-Himalayan region in Uttarakhand, Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge role that these mountain vegetation plays in climate regulation, disaster risk reduction, and much more. But what has happened in last almost 4 to 5 decades is very scary picture. If I talk about forest in India, in 1968, Champion and Seth gave the forest type of the country. But when now you stand in 2021 and you see this picture of Roy et al. That was given in 2015, you see a lot of our native forests are now changing into monocultures. Several stage climax where dominant climatic climate species are not there anymore. And then a lot of agriculture in different parts of the country. So this is a very scary picture of country right now. But there are very not very serious attempts how we can go back better, how we can reverse this entire plan of conserving these landscapes that were once storehouse of biodiversity, indigenous agriculture biodiversity, and a lot of threatened animals. Now, land degradation has a very, very important role to play when we talk about ecosystem health and human well-being. Whenever we try to get one kind of benefit from these ecosystems, for example, if we are only extracting it for agriculture purpose, or we are going for expansion in terms of urbanization, the intensive land use leads to a stage when the land and the landscape and the ecosystems are of no value. So this is the situation where what we call ecosystem collapse. Unfortunately, in India, we have still not assessed our ecosystem in terms of what health they have right now. So this is something that we are trying to do for Western Himalayas, and we're trying to assess the ecosystem health through red listing of ecosystem approach. And what we found as a basic beginning understanding is, initial result is that a lot of our Western Himalayan ecosystems are on the verge of hidden collapse that we are not able to recognize. At the same time, we are seeing it more frequently now in different parts of Western Himalayas. And also would like to stress on local socioeconomic dynamics that was once very nature friendly is now also shaping forest ecosystems. You see a lot of examples of threatened Kida Jadi being extracted for trade for Chinese medicine, or a lot of lichen trade, or a lot of pressure for medicinal and aromatic plants because of the increasing market price, huge market demand. So that has actually resulted in loss of a lot of these species from mountain areas in Indian Himalayan region. Now, because we talk a lot about climate change and we want to see how climate change is affecting our ecosystems, we try to do it for oak species. We locally called it Banj, and Banj are the lifeline of mountains. Like the women are lifeline of mountains, they are the backbone of economy. In the similar way, these rich, moist, temperate, mixed broadleaf forests provide n number of benefits to the people, from food to fodder to fuel wood to a lot of other benefits. At the same time, Niti Aayog report also stress upon loss of Banj oak forest and encroachment by pine, resulting into loss of these forests and might also result in loss of spring shade in the mountains and also affecting the water security. So what we did it was we tried to understand the climatic impact on the niches, the habitat suitability of these forests, while at the same time, I would also like to say that if we include anthropogenic pressure drivers on this climate impacts, I'm sure the impacts of climate change will be manifold, and the loss that we are experiencing from this study will be manifold. So what we found was that the potential habitat of oak forest in this state from 20,900 square kilometer in the present is going to reduce by 4,000 square kilometer by 2070. So this is a very important picture to understand that how much stress these important ecosystems are facing in Himalayas. At the same time, we also found that there is a lot of upward movement of these species to higher reaches. So this Banj oak forest is mostly around 1,500 to 2,000 meters above mean sea level. But now the projections are that it might also move to 2,500 meters above mean sea level upward. While upward movement can be seen as a very interesting phenomena for a lot of ecologists and conservationists, our concern is that if this upward movement happens, what will be the status, what will be the situation of the species that are residing at the higher altitudes, the Betula utilis, the Taxus baccata, and a lot of medicinal and aromatic plants that are in alpine and subalpine areas. So this upward movement might also affect a lot of threatened species at the higher altitudes. Now, the similar concern we also faced for Hippophyes salicifolia, locally called as seabuck thorn, and China and India also have developed a lot of medicinal products, pharmaceutical products, cancer drugs, aid drugs, and so on and so forth. And it is also important, but because this is the only species that can help in slope stabilization and reducing landslide in the higher reaches of Himalayas. But what we found was, again, that almost 80% of these species will lose its probable habitats. And by 75%, there will be some gain. That gain will be about 5%. But if you see that 5% gain from the current situation, this is almost negligible. So this shows the scary picture of climate change in the Himalayas, but at the same time, we should not neglect, we should not ignore the impact of bigger hydropower projects, something that Sri Sundar Lal Bahuguna ji fought for the entire life. We should not forget the impact of uncontrolled four laning of roads in the higher Himalayas, the all-weather roads that have devastated these fragile and sensitive ecosystems. Now, this situation is not only for Himalayas or Western Ghats or sensitive high biodiversity hotspots. We also tried to look to some of the cities in the country, and starting from the city where I live in, if you see this picture from 1990, that is much more green, and Nagpur at one point of time was one of the greenest cities in the country. And if you see the picture in 2018, you find that we now live in a concrete jungle and with few islands of greenery. So this was again an alarming thing, but I think this has become an obvious reality across the country. And if we see the exponential increase that the city is facing, and we try to understand the demand-supply gap of green-blue spaces in the city to local public, we found that there is a significant gap in demand-supply gap. We don't have managed good urban public green spaces that where people can go have that kind of benefits, psychological benefits. At the same time, if we talk about the urban guidelines of 2014 that talks about 10 to 12 meters square per capita of green space for every citizen in urban area, We found that this is around 2.32 meters, and the lowest was 0.27 meters. So this is again a very important finding. And I think this is the condition that is more or less now very common in different cities of the country. This is not only the figure of metro cities, but also tier 2 and tier 1 cities of the country. And last year, before COVID hit all of us, we tried to understand the people's perspective, to understand what they understand by demand supply gap. And based on that, we reached out to more than 1,000 respondents, and we graded this entire city based on people perception, what they think are the red areas where there is total devoid of greenery. We also tried to look to the orange areas where they think there is some greenery, but that requires significant measure by local municipal authorities, and also some of the green spaces, obviously, where there are a lot of urban forest or campus forest, but they require continuous efforts to conserve them. And we found that about in 100 wards that we surveyed, about 50 wards were having greenery. But at the same time, almost 50% of wards were not having enough of greenery that can fulfill the requirements of people in terms of pollution reduction, heat island, and so on and so forth. This is again one of the interesting pictures that we found from one of our study last year, and we tried to understand what happened when COVID affected us. There was a lot of stress and anxiety among people because we all were isolated. We were sitting in our houses. There was no travel happening. Our workplaces were closed, and enhanced television, social media, and work assignments actually resulted in no outdoor recreation, no connection with the nature. And what we observed in social media, and we tried to access the data from different parts of the world, and we found there has been significant increase in urban foraging across the world. People are going out, people are searching their backyards, people are trying to see what nature can offer them. And that is what has been consumed in last few months. There was a lot of psychological benefit. People started looking to kitchen gardening or doing some other kind of activity to actually not only secure some kind of food for their families, but also it became a lot of good physical exercise that gave them psychological benefits. So nature is not only giving you direct benefits, it has larger benefits that we have been talking in Japan and other countries, but this has been very, very common in the country like in India, where from centuries, from our ancient articles, we know that nature gives us everything. And this psychological benefit also helps you to improve our building your immunity against a lot of diseases. Now, overall synthesis, what I can present is that a much sophisticated understanding is required when we talk about conservation with a very multidisciplinary approach. And this multidisciplinary approach can only help us to achieve a lot in nature conservation. So nature conservation should not be taken as a responsibility of an ecologist, a botanist, a zoologist. It should be a lot of people where a sociologist, an economist, a political scientist, a policymaker, a student, academician, everybody can come together and provide their inputs to this important subject and understanding. Now, area where I started working after IUCN identified my work as a nature-based solution approach when I was working in Himalayas, and my PhD outcomes let me understand that women are on the verge of drudgery because they have to walk longer distances to collect fodder for their animal, because livestock rearing is one of the important livelihood for them. So that is how I ventured into nature-based solution, and we last year came up with this important volume that covers a lot of important success stories and failure stories of nature-based solutions from Asia. While this very interesting term was originated in Horizon 2020 program of European Union sometime in 2010 and 12, but I must say, though we have not given a very buzzword or interesting terminology to nature-based solution, I find this has been happening for ages in India in different communities, by different communities for nature conservation. So nature-based solution basically addresses societal challenges. So that can be reducing microclimate, improving disaster risk reduction approaches, safe habitat, water conservation, food security, so on and so forth, that can ensure human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And it is in a subject in itself, if you see, because from protection, issue-specific conservation, infrastructure conservation for urban areas, management of natural areas, and restoration of nature areas, there are a whole lot of options. But at the core of this nature-based solution lies people. Unless people are participating in these programs, their livelihood is somewhere attached to these kind of programs, we cannot say that it is a nature-based solution. So nature-based solution is an approach that puts people and their resources in the center of decision making, because we cannot take people out of nature, and nature is very much connected to people and their lifestyles. It not only talks about use of biodiversity, it also seeks a balance between conservation and consumption of biodiversity around us. At the same time, it's not only relevant for professionals like us or practitioners, it is right now important for everyone, people who are students, those who are academicians, those who are urban planners. They all need to come and understand what nature-based solution is to actually participate in this program and try to seek new knowledge and try to contribute new information so that it can be developed in a better way. So this helps to identify and understand the process of the change in ecosystems, both spatio-temporally, and how it can help to find adaptive strategies for spatio-temporal conservation of ecosystem to solve site-specific solutions for societal challenges. While Convention on Biodiversity recognizes it, I must say that now UNFCCC now acknowledges it, Ramsar Convention acknowledges it, Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction acknowledges it. So it's a package right now. Everyone understands and realizes that unless and until we acknowledge nature conservation efforts, unless and until we ensure that nature is protected, no climate change reduction, no disaster risk reduction can be achieved. So there's one of the interesting slides that I always say, and in no way I undermine the efforts of engineers that work with us. We know that a lot of gray engineering structures have been erected to actually control disasters, but they can be only short-term solutions because they only help to reduce disaster risk and hazard mitigation for a very short span of time. And even if they could do it for a longer span of time, they don't bring co-benefits. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, these are the solutions that not only help to reduce disaster risk, hazard mitigation, help you to climate change adaptation because they are beautiful sinks. They also help in a lot of co-benefits, from sustainable livelihoods to giving aesthetic benefits, increasing water percolation and recharging groundwater aquifers, microclimate stabilization, conservation are so many benefits that we have seen are part of nature-based solution. And they can be implemented in natural areas, rural ecosystems, and also in urban areas. So there are array of benefits and array of approaches how it can be done. So these are different ways how nature-based solutions can be thought about. Ecological restoration, ecological engineering, forest landscape restoration that Bond Challenge has been talking about, and few of the countries are really actually taking it very seriously for conservation by somehow not promote this monsoon plantation that doesn't take care after plantation. So post-plantation care is something that should be very much part of forest landscape restoration. Ecosystem-based management, disaster risk reduction. So there are a lot of ways, and it is a subject in itself that not only helps you to ensure nature's contribution to people, but also to ensure a lot of benefits that can help the nations, help the countries to meet their international commitments and international targets. Recently, IUCN has also launched global standards of nature-based solution. I'll not go in detail, but because it is available online, but just stressing societal challenges are in the core of these global standards. Designing at what scale you are doing, is it a local scale, landscape scale, or ecosystem scale? What kind of net gains you are targeting? How inclusive is your governance approach? Economic feasibility. So cost effectiveness is one of the very important aspects of nature-based solution that can help in adaptive management and mainstreaming, not only conservation, but also sustainable use of wild species. So this is the overall package. I'm sure we need more time to discuss in detail on those, but these are some of the basic lines that I would like to share. This was one of the examples that was considered a very good ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction approach that we started sometime in 2009 in Upper Kedarnath Valley. And my idea was to only introduce plants that can help and provide fodder benefits to people, because if we go for multi-purpose plantation, I'm sure those who understand Himalayas, they also know that there are a lot of crop depredation because of man-animal conflicts. So this might lead to another problem. And that's why I kept myself focused on fodder plantation in this particular village cluster. And it took me almost 2 years to actually convince people that why it is important to have fodder plant. And not only we restored an entire wasteland, we also used a lot of fodder in cropland bunds. And master trainers help local women, because these are the people who are first interested people in these villages who come forward and want to learn. So this really helped us to develop and upscale this model in 4 to 5 years. And the economic cost and benefit of this socio-ecological approach, I thought, was only limited to conservation of these forests, and at the same time reducing forest forays of these women. But we later on in 2013, when Himalayan tsunami hit this valley very badly, we found that soil erosion in these forests, in these villages, were comparatively less than many other villages where erosion control was not addressed. At the same time, landslides were quite less. And the main USP of this project, why people participated in mass, was the fodder that plants were fast growing, high biomass yielding native species. And when they were fed to animals, their lactation yield also increased. And Kedarnath site is actually very much a site where every year 5,000 to 7,000 pack animal pressure is there. So these kind of grass production actually help local to sell some quantity to these pack animal holders and some kind of revenue. So environmental sustainability was the approach, cost effectiveness was there, and social and economical responsibility, because people were dependent, was addressed. And in 2016, the model was handed over to Mahila Mangal Dals, and we have a proper monitoring in place that happens every year to ensure that rotational harvesting in village common land takes place. Now, at the same time, I would also like to stress on one of the recent findings of our work on agroforestry. Again, a native indigenous practice that has been developed in Asia and different parts of the world by community participation for ages. At the same time, has been recently highlighted in climate dialogues and discussions that it can actually help achieving a lot of climate adaptation and mitigation targets. So this is something that, again, people need to understand, those who are new farmers, because I see a lot of youngsters now embracing farming and going back to their roots, need to understand why we need to promote these kind of opportunities and options for the larger community that can help conserve nature biodiversity, including pollinators for their good productivity of croplands. Last but not the least, this is one of the, again, conceptual idea that we proposed last year, because we talk about Western planning for restoration in our country that cannot be successful. So why not we go for hybrid knowledge framework, where scientists propose their scientific knowledge that can help rewilding as well as active restoration, and leave half of the knowledge contribution to indigenous communities, where they can suggest the species that should be planted, because I use this knowledge in fodder bank model. And at the same time, they also leave this responsibility for mass propagation of identified species that can be many times lesser known, underutilized plants. And they have this knowledge of seed bank conservation, seed collection, and mass propagation that can give them some kind of livelihood if this approach can be well linked with commercial enterprises. Last but not the least, the most important post-restoration monitoring phase that has been so far neglected and ignored in Indian plantation and restoration approaches. This is the place where citizen scientists can be involved. We see a lot of citizen science involvement right now in wildlife studies. Why don't we harness and use this approach even in post-restoration modeling and monitoring, and also using science-based approach like UAV, drone-based monitoring and big data analytics to contribute to this hybrid knowledge for achieving UN Decade on Restoration. With this, I come to the last slide. And I propose few of the collaborative efforts that will be very much required based on my understanding in last 115 years, that we do have a lot of good policies, but we don't have convergence of policies. So if convergence happens to conserve native biodiversity and restoration of ecosystem, I think we can achieve much more than what is expected and what we are achieving right now. Funding should go beyond umbrella and charismatic species, because we have a lot more beyond these umbrella species and charismatic species. And in the conservation, we many times avoid and ignore so many smaller these species that have played a very important role in ecosystem stability. We need to seriously and very importantly shift from current impact assessment approach to value creation approach. What value has been created by these bigger industrialists and corporates, instead of having just employment that maybe make them unskilled labor. So something in that respect needs to be considered at policy level and also at local level. Promoting ecological succession models of afforestation. We have only talked about them in ecology. We have only understood them in books. But when we see that not happening on ground, we understand where is the gap in our afforestation plans. Of course, we have a lot of microplastic, persistent organic pollutants going back to our lands and waters and marine areas. So persistent organic pollutants are one of the biggest concerns right now that we are not discussing enough seriously. So this needs to be done. Of course, multi-stakeholder involvement. We should not sit in silos of ecologists and botanists and zoologists. Let us involve all those who are not even subject experts, are not belonging to these streams, to actually contribute and ensuring access and benefit sharing that helps our indigenous and local knowledge systems and indigenous and local communities. So with this, I thank you all for your patience, and thank you Biodiversity Congress for inviting me for this very, very esteemed session. Thank you so much.